I want the cleanest water on earth. I want the cleanest air on earth.
We will see desertification, drought, crop failure, and mass movements of humanity on a scale not seen before.
If China and the United States do not work together on climate, everything else can wait. Every other conflict, every other dispute.
When world leaders gather at climate summits like COP30, the discussion is framed as a problem of emissions, technology, and future commitments. But the climate crisis did not begin in the 21st century. It began centuries earlier, when the colonial empires reorganized the planet's land, labor, and ecology in the service of extraction. Climate change is not merely a failure of modern governance, it is the afterlife of empire. To understand today's global climate emergency, we must first confront climate colonialism, the historical process through which colonial powers transformed diverse, self-sustaining ecosystems into engines of profit, permanently destabilizing the Earth's climate systems. European colonialism was not just political domination, it was ecological reprogramming. From the 16th century onwards, colonial powers viewed land not as a living system, but as a resource to be optimized. Forests were cleared, rivers redirected, and soils exhausted to serve distant imperial markets. Colonial administrators imposed new land use regimes that replaced complex adaptive indigenous systems with simplified extractive ones, where local communities practiced crop diversity, rotational farming, and ecological balance. Colonial rule introduced monocultures, single-crop economies designed for export and not sustainability. Sugar in the Caribbean, cotton in India, rubber in Southeast Asia, coffee in Africa, these plantations were ecological time bombs. They stripped soil nutrients, increased vulnerability to pests, encouraged deforestation, and locked entire regions into dependency on global commodity markets. This was not accidental, it was structural. Monoculture agriculture was central to colonial profit, but disastrous for the environment. Diverse ecosystems regulate water, store carbon, and maintain soil health. Monocultures do none of this. They demand chemical inputs, irrigation, and constant land expansion. British colonial rule in India offers a clear example. Traditional Indian agriculture had evolved over millennia to cope with droughts, floods, and variable monsoons. The British dismantled these systems and reoriented farming towards cash crops like indigo, tea, cotton, and opium. The result was ecological fragility. When monsoons failed or markets collapsed, famine followed. Between the late 18th and early 20th centuries, colonial India experienced dozens of major famines, killing tens of millions. These were not natural disasters. They were climate shocks intensified by colonial land policies. Colonialism did not cause climate variability, but it removed society's ability to adapt to it. Climate colonialism is also inseparable from the rise of fossil fuels. The Industrial Revolution, often portrayed as a European achievement, was powered by colonial extraction. Coal from Britain, rubber from Malaya, oil from the Middle East, and minerals from Africa fueled industrial growth that massively increased carbon emissions. Colonies were not allowed to industrialize on their own terms. They were deliberately locked into the role of raw material suppliers. This created a global division of labor in which the global north polluted while the global south absorbed the ecological damage. By the early 20th century, colonial empires had already laid the foundations of today's carbon inequality. The countries least responsible for historical emissions were being environmentally destabilized to support the prosperity of those most responsible. This imbalance remains central to climate politics today. Perhaps the most devastating impact of climate colonialism was the destruction of indigenous ecological knowledge. Colonized societies had developed sophisticated ways of managing land, water, and forests. These systems were dismissed by colonial authorities as backward or inefficient. Forests that indigenous communities treated as shared ecological spaces were declared state property and logged for profit. Rivers were dammed without regard for downstream communities. Pastoral systems were broken up by fixed borders and private ownership. In Africa, colonial conservation policies often expelled local populations from their lands in the name of environmental protection, while continuing large-scale extraction elsewhere. This created the paradox of colonial environmentalism, protecting nature from its original inhabitants while exploiting it for the empire. The loss of indigenous land stewardship has had long-term climate consequences, reducing biodiversity and resilience across entire regions. Today, the countries most vulnerable to climate change, like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sudan, the Sahel, Pacific Island states, share a common history, i.e., colonial extraction without ecological investment. Floods, heat waves, desertification, and food insecurity hit hardest where colonial economies dismantled local resilience. Infrastructure was built to extract resources, not to protect populations. Cities expanded without planning. Agriculture remained dependent on unstable global markets. Climate vulnerability is not random. It follows the map of the empire. This is why climate change cannot be addressed solely through technological fixes or emissions targets. It is a question of historical responsibility. Modern climate negotiations increasingly recognize the concept of climate debt, the idea that industrialized nations owe reparations to those whose lands and labor made their emissions possible. Colonial powers accumulated wealth by externalizing environmental costs.
If China and the United States do not work together on climate, everything else can wait. Every other conflict, every other dispute.
The atmosphere became a dumping ground for carbon, just as colonies had been dumping grounds for waste, exploitation, and risk. Even today, Global South countries are pressured to limit emissions without having enjoyed the historical benefits of carbon-intensive development. Meanwhile, multinational corporations, many descended from colonial enterprises, continue to extract resources under the language of development. This is climate colonialism in modern form. At forums like COP30, colonial histories are often acknowledged rhetorically but rarely addressed structurally. Discussions focus on future emissions while sidelining past injustice. Climate finance pledges remain inadequate. Adaptation funds fall short. Loss and damage mechanisms are resisted by former colonial powers wary of legal liability. Without confronting colonial origins, climate policy risks repeating the same pattern. Solutions designed by the powerful, imposed on the vulnerable without addressing root causes. A genuine response to the climate crisis requires decolonizing environmental thinking. This means restoring indigenous land rights, valuing local ecological knowledge, restructuring global trade, and recognizing historical responsibility. It also means understanding that climate change is not only an environmental issue, it is a political and moral one. The planet was reorganized through empire. Its repair cannot ignore that history. The global climate crisis is not humanity's collective failure in the abstract. It is the outcome of specific historical systems, colonialism, capitalism, and extraction that enriched a few while destabilizing the many. As the world debates emissions and targets, the deeper question remains unanswered. Who reshaped the earth and who paid the price? Until climate action confronts colonial legacies head-on, the crisis will remain unresolved. Not because solutions are impossible, but because justice is inconvenient. Climate change is not just warming temperatures, it is history catching up.